Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is John. I am the event coordinator here at Murder by the Book. And before I bring out Matthew and Chris, I'll just do some general store announcement, let you guys know what is going on with us. I'm sure you probably saw our newsletter or Facebook that due to some staffing issues, we are going to be doing limited hours this week. We were open 10 to 4 today. We'll be open 10 to 4 tomorrow. 10 to 2 tomorrow. We are working on rescheduling our event with Claudia Gray, which is probably going to be on June 11th. I should have more details about that real soon. And I think we're going to be open normal hours on Sunday, but we'll kind of get we'll make that decision a little bit closer to Sunday. We apologize for the inconvenience. You can always visit us at murderbooks.com or shoot us an email, and we'll still happily get you taken care of. We are in the mix of doing in-store and virtual events. So next week, we've got a really great lineup. We're going to be chatting with Stephen Lloyd virtually on Tuesday. On Wednesday, Boyd Morrison and his sister Beth Morrison are going to be in the store talking about their new release. May Cobb is going to be in the store on Thursday talking with Ashley Winstead. Allie Plater, who's got a really great Knitting Cozy series, is going to be in the store next Friday. And then next Saturday, we're doing 2 offsite events with Jack Carr at Memorial City Mall. So as you're looking at the store's website, you'll see things are either going to be listed as in-store or virtual. We hope that you'll keep turning in for the virtual stuff. And if somebody's coming through in-store that you're excited about, please come see them. We're kind of starting over from scratch, trying to show publishers that there is a need for being able to have authors in the store and connect with readers that way. So we hope that you will come visit. We're so excited for tonight's event. We were just mentioning beforehand that Matthew Quirk was actually the first virtual event that we did back probably almost exactly 2 years ago. I think we started them in May of 2020. So he was the first one that I got to do. And he was, like he said, he was our guinea pig. So I'm going to bring him out first. How are you tonight, Matthew?
I'm good. We talked a little bit before. It's good to see you again, I'll say.
Yeah. So Matthew's new book, Red Warning, is going to be out on June 7th, and we'll make sure that he gets a chance to tell you guys a little bit about that as well. He is the New York Times bestselling author of Hour of the Assassin, The Night Agent, The 500, The Directive, Cold Barrel Zero, and Dead Man's Switch. He spent 5 years at The Atlantic reporting on crime, private military contractors, terrorism prosecutions, and international gangs, and he lives in San Diego, California. And I'm going to bring out Chris Holm. We're so excited to do something virtually with Chris. We've been fans of his for years, so we're excited to bring him to Murder by the Book even virtually. How are you tonight, Chris?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the release of Child Zero.
Thank you so much. I wish I could be there to celebrate in person.
Yeah, we'll make sure it happens next time. When your next one comes out, we will definitely get you to Houston.
Absolutely.
So Chris Holm is the author of the cross-genre collector trilogy, the Michael Hendricks thrillers, and 30-odd short stories in a variety of genres. His work has been selected for the Best American Mystery Stories and named a New York Times Editor's Choice, appeared on more than 50 years' best list, and won a number of awards, including the 2016 Anthony Award for Best Novel. He lives in Portland, Maine. So while Matthew and Chris are talking tonight, if you guys have questions for either of them about these new books, previous books, any of that stuff, please post those in the comments on Facebook or the live chat on YouTube, and we will get to them in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to you, gentlemen, and I will see you in just a little bit.
Thanks, John.
All right. I guess I wanted to start by just raving about the book to the audience. And I know you, and I knew you were working on this incredibly ambitious book. And as another writer, when somebody's working on like a really ambitious book, you're like, that sounds awesome, and you're also like, I'm praying for him, and then, I got it. I was fortunate to get an early copy, and I was completely blown away and really just like in awe of how you took this really ambitious story with such scale, that was so grounded in like real hard science and then like these wonderful characters with really visceral stakes, and the thing is just a bullet. It like builds this whole world and then just like is off to the races. It's not like, oh, let me tell you about the history of that. It's just it's all action. So it's a great book. And when we were emailing, I had to dork out a little bit because you got this great rave from Lee Child, and then you got this rave from Stephen King, who's like one of my writing heroes. and you deserve it. It's a fantastic book, so everybody should buy it. Support Chris, Murdered by the Book, and I thought maybe we'd start by just asking you, like, what's a thumbnail version, kind of jacket copy summary of the book, or how do you get people into it?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, before we start talking about my brand new book, baby, I just wanted to say, since it's the first time I've gotten to see you face to face in a long time, congratulations on your actual brand new human baby,
Yes.
who is beautiful and adorable.
Thank you.
How is parenthood treating you?
It's treating us really well. Yeah. I mean, the way my book schedule worked out, I was able to, like, without delaying things, take, I think, 3 months off.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's just great. Because, you're a writer too, and I get, like, very focused on stuff. So to just have undivided baby time, and everything's gone really well, and we're really blissed out and fortunate. So yeah.
Well, congrats to you guys both.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Now I guess I have to answer your question. So I've been pitching this story as a fact-based thriller in the vein of Michael Crichton that takes place in a world reeling from the collapse of the antibiotic era. It centers on a young boy named Matt, who is the sole survivor of an attack on a shantytown in Central Park, and the two detectives, Jake and Amy, who are tasked with investigating the crime. And so, absolutely, my background being in molecular biology, I really endeavored to make the science as realistic as possible and not cut any corners. So that was one of my goals going in. But the other goal that I had going in was precisely what you said, which was pace. I knew if I was going to write a scientific thriller, I didn't want it to be a doorstop. I didn't want it to just be for fellow nerds who are really into this stuff. I wanted it to be the sort of thing where, even if the science is meant to educate the public about a looming existential threat that our species faces, that, like, the action and the paciness is sort of the spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down.
Yeah, and I mean, I was blown away by it, and what's crazy is we lived through this pandemic, and I'll ask about that. But, like, this pandemic is nothing on your pandemic, and your pandemic is super realistic. So I just, for readers who, and without giving too much away, but like, how realistic is this scenario? And maybe, I don't know, I just wanted to compliment the book because it's medically realistic, but it also is done in a nuanced way. So it's like, it's clearly happening in a real America with like all our society, our fault lines. It's not just this, like, people in a lab somewhere. It really, like, brings in society and politics. I'm really impressed with that. But yeah, so, like, how realistic is this?
Yeah, so I think this is the number one question I've been getting. I'm just starting to get used to how to talk about this book in events. You live with a book for a while, and you learn how to answer the questions that come up over and over again. And with this, I'm just starting to see those patterns because I'm just doing these interviews. But I think the one thing everybody wants to ask me is, you fudged a little, right? Like, this can't really happen. And I really wish I could tell you it was science fiction. It absolutely isn't. For example, I actually have some quotes that I've been going to lately, because I think what people need to realize is scientists as a whole are not terribly prone to hyperbole. Like, picture Fauci behind the lectern, at the briefings in the early days. He was very circumspect. He's direct, but he's not dire. He's very circumspect. And so I'd like to just read a couple of quotes from public health officials about the threat of widespread antibiotic resistance. So this one is from a physician in a 2014 forward to a World Health Organization report. He said, a post-antibiotic era in which common infections and minor injuries can kill, far from being an apocalyptic fantasy, is instead a very real possibility for the 21st century. That was in 2014. In 2019, the CDC director said, stop referring to a coming post-antibiotic era. It's already here. You and I are living in a time when some miracle drugs no longer perform miracles, and families are being ripped apart by a microscopic enemy. And then in 2021, in a piece for the journal Science, two physicians, this quote chills me because, again, this is 2021, the height of the COVID pandemic, and they thought this is what we should be focusing on. They say, unless researchers develop new antibiotics and therapeutics, the decimation of modern medicine will soon become a reality. And I thought that was just beyond chilling. This is something that I've been aware of for a while, because it's just, it's sort of baked into the kind of science that I have been doing for the past 20 years. And it's certainly, these sorts of dire warnings do get out in the press all the time. It's been covered by everybody from, the BBC and the Washington Post to Wired and Vox and a number of other outlets. But largely, the public seems unmoved. And I think it's because they have trouble grasping the enormity of the threat. I don't think they realize how deeply and seriously antibiotics have reshaped our society. And so they have no concept of what a world without them would look like.
Yeah. And it's the way people maybe have started taking vaccines for granted, or aren't as scared of things because no one's seen somebody, affected by polio or something.
Right. Yeah.
And then I thought maybe we should touch briefly on your background. I first met you at a Left Coast Crime as this awesome genre crossover author, cool music guy and all this with all the other music nerds in Mulholland. And then I was like, oh, you're also this super scientist. So how did that come in?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I was a super scientist, but I was definitely a scientist. It's funny to say, but I think the trajectory of my life was set in large part by an aptitude test I took in fourth grade that placed me into an advanced science track. And I thanks to a teacher, one of the teachers that the book's dedicated to, a guy by the name of Nick Lepre, I found just a passion for biology when I took it, I guess, my freshman year in high school. And one of the greatest things about Mr. Lepre was I was a straight A student. I was a nerd. And he was the first teacher who ever sat me down and was like, I don't think you are living up to your potential. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? I have an A in your class. And he was like, yeah, but you're kind of phoning it in. And I think you could really do something with it if you applied yourself. And that was a wake up call for me. And I just developed a passion for biology that I carried through to college, where I discovered, thanks to the other person that the book is dedicated to, a professor by the name of Susan Morgan, an interest in microbiology and molecular biology. So when I graduated, I was serious enough about that interest that I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Virginia's School of Medicine. I wanted to be a bug hunter for the CDC, like one of the people they drop into the Bumba zone of Zaire when there's an outbreak of Ebola or something. That did not come to pass. It turns out I didn't really enjoy academia the way I thought I would, but it was fun. I enjoyed the research. So when I was at the University of Virginia, I did a lot of tropical medicine research. I was part of a lab that was trying to create an edible vaccine against amoebic dysentery, which is actually an easily curable disease in the first world, but a major killer in the third world. And that's something I think because I have a background in tropical medicine, that's something I carried with me to Child Zero, because I think much along the lines of what William Gibson said about the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I think the same thing can be said for a lot of public health initiatives. What public health looks like in the United States is very different from what it looks like in Bangladesh or Western Africa. So, I wanted to touch on sort of that iniquity in Child Zero, and I think that's something that plays out in the story quite a bit. But after I decided I didn't want to pursue a PhD, I took a job in a lab on the coast of Maine, where I discovered a gene in spiny lobster that resulted in a patent. That was a lot of what I did. I did a lot of sort of gene discovery, DNA sequencing, stuff like that. And then after that, I took a job with a company in Maine called IDEX. That's like an S&P 500 company. They make predominantly like diagnostic tests, a lot like what you would take as a rapid test for COVID, although mostly they focus on like keeping our furry friends healthy. But they also do stuff like water testing on the International Space Station. And I worked there in R&D for a while. So I had kind of a broad swath of scientific knowledge to draw on. And I mean, this book took me 6 damn years to figure out how to get my head around it, because it's this, as you said, it's not just a public health story. It ripples out into geopolitics, into things like food scarcity. I think that's a thing that people don't really necessarily equate with antibiotics, but factory farming relies heavily upon antibiotics to meet demand. And so if they stop working, in fact, I think it's something like 90% of all antibiotics produced every year go straight into livestock farming. So if those tank on us, we're going to see massive food shortages, which is of course going to cause all kinds of instability in nations that already have, food issues, which causes things like a spike in nationalism, closed borders, closed minds, that sort of thing.
And so I'm fascinated by this because I was reading some other interviews you did, and you said most books you start with a character, and this one started with a premise. And so I used to be a journalist, and I would constantly fall on my face trying to write books because I was writing like about subjects or premises instead of stories. So that, the story would be like, I'd be like, what if the government was like using prisoners as secret soldiers or something? And be like, well, that's a good premise, but like you need the story. So I was just, how did it go to start with a premise? And it's such a broad premise and scale, and you bring in how it affects society and political fault lines. And I mean, I can't imagine, and I've actually tried to write a book with a similar conceit in some ways and fallen on my face. So I'm like especially impressed. How did it go to find these characters, Jake and Hannah, because they're so interesting, and I mean, they just seem like real people, and the stakes are so realistic. So how does it go from starting with a premise that some people might be like, yeah, I'd read a paper article, a newspaper article about that, to finding a story where somebody's just like, are these guys going to be okay?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for saying that. And it's funny to hear you say that you've fallen on your face trying to write books from premise, because one of the things I think is a hallmark of your fiction is you have such a strong voice. Your characters, I feel like I know them. Whenever I read your stuff, I really get a sense of them as people, and I always think of your books as very character driven. So it's really interesting to hear you say that you've struggled with that in the past. The answer of how I did it is badly, honestly. At first, I really struggled for a long time trying to wrap my head around this. Normally, when I write a book, I have a character nattering in my head, maybe for just an individual scene. But I'll see a scene from their perspective, and I'll try and interrogate it and say, okay, who is this person, and what are they doing, and what can I learn about them from the way they talk, from their vocabulary, from where they find themselves, and I really love building out from that, taking a person and then figuring out the world that they belong in. And in this case, what happened was, my agent and I have a great relationship where we both just are geeks about story. And so we spend a lot of time just kicking around cool ideas, like, oh, hey, I thought of this great idea for, an escape story from a jail, I was going to do like a Rikers Island sort of escape story. And he was like, yeah, that's cute. That's nice. And we'd kick it around a bit. And then, I pitched him a few things as a follow-up to my second Hendricks book, Red Right Hand. And then I said, but one thing I'm really intrigued by is writing a novel that takes place in a post-antibiotic era. And he was like, explain that. Tell me what that means. And I was like, well, for one thing, diseases that we've long thought beaten will come surging back. Transplants, organ transplants, and implants of any kind will be a thing of the past because, it's just too risky without antibiotics being able to prevent infection. And I started listing all these real world sort of things that could happen. And he's like, well, this sounds really like some fertile ground to explore. This feels like the project you should write. But the problem was I had no idea, how to tackle it or what my through line was. And that actually turned out to be a blessing in a lot of ways, because what happened was I really immersed myself in the research, in lay publications and scientific journals. I mean, my book has a bibliography, for God's sake. Like, I really wanted to show my work and prove, that I'd really, really dug into this. But what I liked about that was, much like reading a newspaper article about it, I would pick these characters up as I did the research. These people, who have, I knew that I didn't want to have a bunch of talking heads in a lab. I cheated a little bit. I do have a character that wears a lab coat for one scene because she happens to be a medical doctor. And what I thought was interesting about that was I needed someone who could believably explain just the skeleton of how this happened. I didn't have to go into a crazy ton of detail about how the world got to where it was, but I always view it like a sketch comedy. If you buy the premise, you buy the bit. I needed someone who could lay out the premise very simply, and from a boots on the ground kind of way, because she was a promising cardiothoracic fellow before the antibiotic era collapsed, and now she can't do that anymore. Like, there are no cardiothoracic surgeons, because you're just not cutting people open and messing with their heart, because you can't patch them back up and expect them to be okay anymore. So there's a line in Hannah's opening chapter about how now all surgeons are trauma surgeons, and she's a soldier on the front lines of a war we're losing badly. So that was my one little cheat, but I knew I didn't want to have a bunch of scientists in a lab. I didn't want to have any scenes of someone giving a lecture. That always drives me crazy when science nerds just trying to, Dan Brown, not to call him out, loves to have a guy behind a lectern, elucidating the key points of his novel. And like, it's exactly as exciting as sitting through a lecture. So I wanted to avoid that, but I knew I wanted to have a child migrant for thematic reasons and for scientific reasons. And that I found very daunting because I'm well aware that I'm writing a mixed race child from a place of privilege, but it was so vitally important to the story. I honestly probably spent the better part of a year trying to get a handle on that character, Mateo, and who he was and where he came from and how he got here and why. Because I realized very quickly he was the heart of the book. And if I skimped on him at all, if I didn't know him, then it was going to show, and it was going to be a disaster. And thankfully,
he could be like a device, but he's a real person.
Right, exactly. And that, I'm so glad you said that, because that became a guiding principle too. There are so many people doing great work, so many people who have marginalized voices who are doing great work in crime and in thrillers today. And I do not want to try and take space that would be better suited for them. So I knew I couldn't tell the entire story from his perspective. The ostensible protagonist, Jacob Gibson, is, he's a straight white guy. He's a cop. His partner happens to be a young hijabi woman who I think is my favorite character in the book. I think Amy is just an absolute delight every time she's on screen, so to speak. But I knew I didn't want Matt, the kid, to simply be a MacGuffin or, a football to be, passed around from person to person. We're about to get knocked over, by the way, by one of my cats who's trying to horn in. Moxie, come on, I'm being interviewed. Yeah, so I really wanted Matt to be very resourceful in his own right. I wanted him to be clever. I wanted him to be decent and kind. But most of all, I wanted him to have agency at every turn. That was like my watchword, is like, is he being active enough? And then on the flip side, I wanted to make sure I subverted any notion of like a white savior, because that's such a risk. Writing from, if you write with blinders on and only write what you know, you do run the risk of, simply by virtue of putting a white guy in the driver's seat of the story, having him be the hero in all things. In fact, one of the first scenes, I don't outline when I write, but I do have a sense of several tentpole scenes. I usually have the first scene, the last scene, and a few key sequences in between in mind before I sit down to write. And one of them that I knew I wanted to include very, very early on was I have this trio of characters that spend a lot of time in the book. It's Jake, the white male detective, his Muslim partner, Amy, who's very close with him. They have an excellent relationship. But she is aware that, as a white male cop, he lives in a very different world than she does. She's younger than he is. She made detective fairly early in her career because she's a terrific cop. But she deals with a lot of blowback because of her gender, because of her faith, because of her color. And then Matt. That's sort of the trio that spend a lot of time together in the book. And I knew that the moment they met, I wanted my white male cop to be pointing a gun at this brown child. And I wanted his brown partner to intervene. That was a scene that meant a lot to me to try and get right. Because I think it speaks to biases, both conscious and unconscious, when it comes to things like policing. And, my protagonist, Jake, has to reckon with the fact, after the fact, once he understands the situation he finds himself in, once he understands that he maybe misread it, he has to deal with the fact that, he pointed a loaded gun at a child. And that, it sounds like a potentially heavy thing, but I also thought it was this important step in his evolution. I wanted Jake to have an arc where, yes, there are places he can go and things that he can do because of his own sense of privilege, but he also learns so much throughout the course of this book, and I think has a lot of illusions dispelled along the way. And so that it was just that organic interaction of like these characters bouncing off each other in interesting ways, that and me just constantly trying to check my own privilege and make sure I was considering other perspectives.
Well, and it's, like so many things in the book, like it obviously came out of like you putting your heart and soul into this to like let things just kind of grow, because you could have had like symbol person A, symbol person B doing, but you obviously, these people, you've lived with them long enough that they act like real people. And I liked how I know you're really politically engaged. I like how the politics were like woven in kind of like, not like a way you're like, yeah, that's how a story like this would go, like I don't know, I don't remember if there was a lot of kind of like political dimensions to the stuff in Andromeda Strain, but like,
yeah,
when these things happen, they happen in America, and it happens over the substrate of like politics and our division. So I was so impressed the way you wove that in, and it felt very natural and realistic, and not one of these like, and there's no soapboxing or anything. I was impressed with that.
Yeah, I really tried not to stake out a political position per se. I suppose that's difficult to do when you're writing a story that in part deals with bodily autonomy and marginalized peoples. But that's the interesting thing, I think, when your background's in public health. A big part of public health is politics. It always has been, because you're talking about, scientists, I think, have an obligation to prosecute their case. If we need to do mass vaccinations, we need to be good at messaging. We need to be good at getting things done within various political systems. And not for nothing, one of the best ways to eradicate a disease is at the point of a gun. You'll see throughout history, a lot of dictatorships do a great job of eradicating diseases because they can line up their populace and force them to get vaccinated, for example. That is not something I support. Obviously, I'm pretty passionate about civil liberties. But I do think when you're in public health, you are constantly aware of that push and pull between the science and the public understanding, public perception, the politics of the moment. And, you pull on that thread, and it's gonna affect all, the entire tapestry. It's really, it was interesting for me to delve into, but if I had tried to write this book in a year or even in 2 years, it would have been a lousy version of itself. Yeah. I knew I wanted to take a big swing. I think if you told me it was going to take 6 years from conception to coming out, I might have chickened out and gone to a different project.
Well, I'm glad you walked into the machine gun fire with like a bullet on, this like old hand guy I used to talk to, like he was a book critic and stuff, and he was helping me when I was starting out. And he was like, no, don't worry about the second book. I had a lot of pressure for my second book. He's like, don't worry about the second book. It's the third that's the essay. That's the one that really gets you. And then my second book like blew up in my face. I had to rewrite it. It was so horrible. And I went to him and I'm like, what? Why? I thought you said the third one was hard. He's like, no, of course it's the second one. I was just trying to make it feel better. What?
That's amazing. Well, yeah. And yeah, you had a lot of pressure for your second book because your first book, The 500, was terrific. I mean, it did gangbusters, and it's a wonderful story. I actually, I know you know this. I'm saying this largely for the audience, but like when I teach workshops on suspense, The 500 is one of the books that I use as an example because you do some really beautiful stuff in it. So yeah, you really set yourself up. You should have set the bar lower for the first book. Kept a little in the tank.
Yeah. Get as much as you can, and you just try to hang on to the merry-go-round. That's publishing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know how you find it, but I find like writing a second in series isn't quite as daunting to me because so many of the decisions are already made. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a new plot. There's going to be some new characters, but you already know a lot going in. But for me, standalones, I mean, you have to invent it from whole cloth,
Did you plan Hendricks as a series from the beginning?
Yeah, I definitely did.
Yeah, that's The Killing Kind, Chris's other awesome book, which is like a high concept hitman thing, assassin thing. It's so good. Yeah.
I definitely set out to write somebody who I could keep writing, and I hope to continue writing him in the future. But this just spoke to me first. In fact, it's something I haven't talked about much before now. But I'm fairly certain it got included in like the editorial letter they send out with your arcs. So I feel reasonably confident in saying this aloud in public. But Hendricks is going to hopefully end up on the big screen at some point in the not too distant future. The film's in pre-production. It's being co-produced.
Oh, wow.
It's being co-produced by Ryan Gosling. Right now, I believe Ben Foster is set to star as Hendricks. And so, I sincerely hope unless it's an epic disaster, which, would be a bummer. I would imagine it would bring more interest back to that series. So I'll get a chance to write some more.
I mean, the thing is like born to be filmed, and I knew it was like going around Hollywood and everything. So, that's awesome. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Although that leads me to something I want to ask you about. So tell us a little about the Night Agent. What's going on with the Night Agent?
The Night Agent, probably, I mean, with this like TV film stuff, like sometimes there's a glimmer of hope at the beginning, and then like it's dashed, and then like, it gets optioned forever, and then you're like, okay, I'll just give me updates and we'll see what's going on. So the Night Agent, which I thought it was very set up to be like TV or film. And then we, you know, it was this happens with everything. You know, you keep getting this close, and then finally, when we had sort of like gone around Hollywood, and you know, it was like, oh, this may not come together, or it may take some time. This production company picked it up, and they were new, but they had amazing people. They had like Jamie Vanderbilt, who's this great writer. And it was their first project, and they're really experienced people. And then they were sending around, and then one day they emailed me, and they're like, Sean Ryan, who did The Shield,
oh my God,
has this like Secret Service book, but he thinks, you know, or series he's wanted to do, but he thinks it'd merge with The Night Agent. And I was like, oh, okay, great. And you know, and this is what happens. We're here in our pajamas.
Yeah.
I assume you're wearing pajamas below the screen, and then, you know, every 6 months a film agent, if you're lucky, calls, and you're like, oh, you know, and then nothing happens. And then but then the Sean Ryan thing worked, and then he sold it to Netflix, and then I guess there was like one more hurdle, and so Netflix is filming it now in Vancouver.
Wow.
Like this year or next year. Yeah. So I've never had.
Congratulations.
Before. Thank you. Yeah. But congratulations to you. We're making news tonight at Murder.
We are. We are making news left and right. Yeah. That's exactly right.
So great. Wow, that's awesome. It's such a perfect book for like, just make a movie of this. Come on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And you know, I was very lucky. The guy who optioned it forever ago, Adam Siegel, was responsible for Drive, which is just a terrific, you know, crime story. And so it couldn't have been in better hands. But, you know, as you well know, people option things. That's why I don't really do the big option announcement when an option happens, because, you know, they option something and that's very exciting, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I think, you know, I've heard from plenty of people. In fact, I think I've heard you say this. I might be mistaken, but you know, in publishing, everything's a no until it's a yes. And in Hollywood, everything feels like a yes until it's a no. It's like, if you ever want to get like an ego boost, you talk to somebody from Hollywood, because they're so story literate and enthusiastic, and they really love what you're doing, and they can't wait to work with you. And then you never, ever hear from them again. And, you know, it's cool. Like, I'm not complaining. That's incredible. Like one of the thrills of my life was, you know, I helped put together a pitch for a miniseries for HBO, and it wasn't for one of my things. It was an original idea, and it never ended up happening. But just getting to talk to these really brilliant people who know story, and just getting to be in those rooms, even if it's only virtually, is thrilling. But yeah, I never actually believe anything's going to come of it until something comes of it. And even then, it's a little hard to wrap your head around.
I don't know. This sounds pretty legit. I'm very excited for you.
Well, right. And so, you know, for me, it's, you know, I was, you mentioned, you know, the Stephen King thing, which I still can't fathom happened. But so for those playing along at home, that means that Stephen King knows I exist and Ryan Gosling knows I exist. And that's really weird, right? Like, that's just really weird.
Yeah, like my first book, which I was like an unemployed journalist in DC, like living off of spaghetti. And they're like, yeah, we're sending it to Brad Pitt's people. I'm like, if I knew Brad Pitt's gonna read this book, I'd have done a better job.
Right. Know? Can I give it one more polish?
Yeah, I was trying to keep the lights on.
Oh my God. And yeah, like, and I never know how to take it when somebody says something like that to me, because you want to freak out and be like, oh my God, you know, Brad Pitt, but you're also like, that can't be true. That can't be right. It turns out sometimes it actually is true, and that's remarkable. What a crazy gig we have.
Drive was such a cool, sexy movie. You know?
It really was.
Yeah.
It really was. And if you know, if The Killing Kind got turned into something half as stylish, I'd be beyond delighted.
Oh, that's great. I'm so happy for you. We were talking. We talk, we catch up and like help each other through the ups and downs. And it's so funny because you and I we have these like dark nights of the soul talk a couple of years ago. We're never going to write another book. Like,
Oh yeah.
everything's falling apart. And now, so it's just like,
Yeah, it's like a sine wave, man. I'm sure I'll crash again at some point, but I'll ride the wave for as long as I can. Hey,
yeah.
so you have a book dropping next month, right? On the 7th, is that correct?
Yes.
So what book is that? That's Red Warning, correct?
Red Warning. Yeah. It's like it's based on a real life kind of germ of a thing, which is that the idea that the Soviets had set up kind of sabotage plans and almost laid the groundwork for them during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also true. Like a lot of Soviet like deep cover illegals, they just stayed here after the Soviet Union was dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the kind of two pieces of it. And it's one of these like Russian aggression books, and like, what if Russia really took the gloves off? And I wrote it a year and a half ago, and it's
I was gonna say that's weird because they seem so reasonable as a foreign power. So it's how I feel about Child Zero. Is I had no intention of releasing this book during a pandemic, and I imagine you had no intention of releasing Red Warning amid escalating, almost Soviet style aggression toward the West from Moscow.
Well, this is one of my questions, because the night agent has like a twist about the president potentially being compromised, and then I had to change the book as the sort of like controversy about Trump
Mm-hmm.
went like a crazy idea. It was actually based, the first notion I got, it was when Manafort's ledgers showed up in Ukraine. I don't know if you remember like the yellow ledger and that began.
Yeah.
But I had this book, and they take a year to come out or longer, and so I watched as it became sort of speculative and ahead of the news to being like, oh my god, this is going to seem like not just like ripped from the headlines, but like ripped from headlines 6 months ago. And it was great.
Yeah.
I changed the twists to make it less what you'd expect if you were sort of following the story in the news. And I think it made it a better book. So one of my questions for you was, you are in so deep on this kind of pandemic book. And if that's the right word for the antibiotic resistance thing. And then the pandemic happens. What's that like?
I mean, it obviously, like, I'm not going to say woe is me about that, because like, poor writer guy who wrote a pandemic book and then a pandemic happened, but certainly it rattled me, because I mean, this was intended to be a big swing. This I really, really wrote it to be a big book. I wanted it to be, to harken back to those scientific thrillers that I grew up on. Like Crichton, like Robin Cook, stuff like that. And, I just felt sick about this idea that like I put my heart and soul into trying to write this book that I conceived of as kind of a warning about, what could happen. And then to watch a version of it, a lesser version of it, but a version of it nonetheless, happen in real time. I know it sounds crazy to call it a lesser version, but I genuinely, as a scientist, believe that antibiotic resistance is a bigger threat than novel coronaviruses, and I say that fully acknowledging that COVID has been, I mean, just beyond horrifying. But yeah, so I thought I really struggled with the idea of like, who's going to want to read this, and what I've come to realize is, first of all, it's not a pandemic novel, really. It's more of a breakneck thriller with a pandemic as its backdrop.
Yeah.
You're starting to see some cat whiskers come through here. Moxie, what you doing? Don't knock that down. We're doing so well. So I kind of thought, okay, it's really more of a sort of chase story with a pandemic as its backdrop. And so in that respect, I actually think people have been responding well to it, because it maybe allows them to process some of the stuff we've been going through at a bit of a remove, because it's not exactly the same. But certainly, I think I would have gotten a lot more points for prognostication if, it had come out before the pandemic. But I think I get a lot more points for plausibility since it dropped during a pandemic. And I think you probably experienced the same thing. Like when you're writing the rip from the headline stuff, as you said, it allowed you to pivot and find some new ground to cover. Do you like, not to speak, overtly about Trump in terms of his politics, but when you've got such an outsized figure as a character in real life, do you find you run away from that a little bit, or do you run toward it when you're trying to fictionalize it? Like I found for example, my president in Child Zero is a very different sort of president than Trump was, specifically because I didn't want him to read like a riff on Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, you actually have to tone it down because politics has become so insane, like seemingly so quickly. Like when I worked in journalism in DC, it was like, I mean, there was political scandal, and but it's just gotten so crazy with like, I mean, there was like an assault on the Capitol, which, I mean, it's like things that would have felt totally far-fetched in a book now happen routinely. So,
I was doing something much like this while that was going on. I was actually in this same room. It's like an upstairs bedroom. And I was meeting over Zoom with my entire Edgar committee to decide the best paperback original Edgar. We'd gotten it down to like our final list, and we were like hashing it out. We had like this 3-hour Zoom meeting. And my wife was downstairs, and she was like, "There's an attack on the Capitol." And I was like, "Who?" And she was like, "Just Trump people, just, like MAGA people." It was mind-boggling. And so like we had all these people were, all these writers who were on this call, like paying attention to the second screen, just off, off camera, trying to find out what's going on. It was one of the surrealist things I've ever experienced. And like, you and I are actually fairly well thought of for concocting twisty thrillers. And oh my God, I did not see that coming.
No, and I mean, I wrote an essay for Vox about this because, what we have is in the story this kind of control over everything, and people turn to stories. I mean, it's not this Pat or I guess Pat, where like you just want to see the good guy win, but it's kind of that, it helps you make sense, and like, rights can be wronged, and that's a big part of the appeal of these stories, especially as like the real world gets crazier and crazier. And to touch on what you were just talking about, this like the stuff happening in the background in Child Zero is so scary and so realistically scary that I just like want to watch a cooking show. And then, but the thing, and the way you made it a chase, I like to write a book and set it in that world, and then you did a great job avoiding like dismalism of any kind, and it's just this great chase, and it's got hope in it. And I was really impressed how you did that.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I knew it was going to be one of my darkest books in terms of some of the things I was drawing on, and so it was really important to me. First of all, for it to be, I think it's my most hopeful book, which might be damning it with faint praise, but I also think I'm used to writing really morally compromised characters, typically as protagonists, and there are certainly a couple of morally compromised characters in the book, but this is an interesting one for me because the primary cast of characters, they're all just fundamentally good people, and they're all trying to do the best they can. And I have no problem with people calling the book like post-apocalyptic or dystopian, but I don't see it as that way at all. It's about a new normal, and a scary one, but like, society hasn't crumbled. It's not Mad Max. It's people still go to school and have jobs and do things for fun. They just do it in a much more dangerous world than the one we're currently living in. And it was important to me to make sure that there was a little bit of light and a little bit of hope, because otherwise, I don't want it to be a grim slog. I want it to be a fun read, that is also hopefully, white knuckled and scary. But
yeah, well, mission accomplished.
So are we supposed to tap John back in for a little Q&A?
Yeah, so we've got a couple crowd questions. So this is for both of you. Chris, you've touched on this a little bit, but are there any writers who have influenced your writing?
Oh gosh, there are so many writers who have influenced my writing. One of the things that made me so excited about having Stephen King say some nice stuff about my writing on Twitter is not just that I was a huge fan of his as a kid growing up, but also that he's always championed so many terrific writers that I otherwise would have never been exposed to. So it's kind of, I felt like it was this crazy full circle thing, because he turned me on to people like Donald Westlake, who's an idol of mine, Michael McDowell, the late lamented Michael McDowell, who I don't think is terribly well known. He's a fascinating character. He wrote a lot of Gothic horror that's absolutely terrific. He also wrote some of the first clear PI fiction. And I think he was Michael McDowell. He's a terrific writer, but I think because of his sexuality and because of the sorts of books he wrote, he was often marginalized in his own lifetime. Anne Rivers Siddons was another one that King turned me on to. But anyways, I've been absorbing books like that for the longest time, thanks to King, and it was kind of cool to be a part of that lineage. This book obviously draws a lot from Michael Crichton, simply because of the way he blended the high concept science with sort of the exciting action. But gosh, there are so many people in today's crime fiction community that I admire deeply. Probably the one that my wife is most, sick of hearing me gush about in every single interview I've ever done is Megan Abbott, who I think writes some of the most breathtaking prose and does something that I personally love as a reader, which is she affords me access to a world that I could never experience on my own. Her capacity to write about the secret lives of young women is just beyond riveting. And I love that because she plucked all of the signifiers of noir out of noir. Mm-hmm. She created something new and fresh. So those are the voices that speak to me the most. And those, I wouldn't dare say that you'll see a lot of Megan Abbott influence in my book, but that's only because I'm just not as talented a prose stylist as Megan Abbott. Similarly, I think Tana French has this capacity for taking things that in other hands could feel like a rote procedural and grounding them so deeply in character that they just feel fresh and new and invigorating. So she's somebody I look to as just an astonishing writer.
And how about you, Matt?
Oh, I mean, it's like, I was going to ask Chris about genres because he's been in so many genres. And, it's like, I mean, look at your shelves, So when it comes to spy stuff like Le Carré and Robert Littell and, Michael Connelly is amazing. I always go back to him, Daniel Silva. I love Megan Abbott, and it's insane that I'm like, it's like one of those movies where you have a body transplant thing, because like suddenly I'm like living the interiority of a cheerleader. There's like too many to mention, and then you kind of fall in love with a new author, and then they slowly work into the book. So it's this kind of cool way it all composites.
So speaking of the genres, Ashley wants to know, Chris, she says, transitioning from urban fantasy to crime and then to medical thrillers is a big difference. Are there any reasons to make the change in genre, or was it just a thing that happened?
So when I was a kid, my mom's from a cop family, and they're all giant mystery readers. They read so many mysteries and thrillers, and I think that's where I get that side of things from. My dad's family were a bunch of fantasy and sci-fi geeks, and so I was raised in a house full of books, and I read them completely indiscriminately. It never really occurred to me that for some people, those two things don't quite go together. My first series, yes, absolutely is urban fantasy. I won't argue with that label, but I always kind of considered it cross-genre. That it's essentially telling a fantasy story like an old-fashioned crime pulp. So my influences, I mean, I wore them on my sleeve. They were named after Hammett and Chandler novels. Dead Harvest, The Wrong Goodbye, The Big Reap. They all took their names from classic pulps. I also wrote my first novel, which never got published, was a small-town mystery with sort of a supernatural element to it. And to be perfectly honest, I set out to write a more mainstream crime novel with The Killing Kind, in part because I'd written a short story with that character and I wanted to see more of him. But also because I realized, like, man, what I was writing was awfully niche, and I really, it was, if I ever wanted to make a living at it, I was going to have a tough time doing it, writing collector novels. But really what it comes down to, and I wouldn't say this is a medical thriller, I'd say this is just like a big blockbuster movie, sort of thriller. I've never made that distinction in what I read. I dip into all sorts of different genres, and I guess I just stubbornly refuse to go into one box and stay there when it comes to what I write.
Perfect. So I think that is going to about do it for us this evening. But to recap, for anyone who might have tuned in late, we've been chatting with Chris Holm, whose new book, Child Zero, just came out last Tuesday. And we've been chatting with Matthew Quirk, whose upcoming book, Red Warning, is going to be out on June 7th. If you missed any part of our chat this evening, once we're done, Facebook and YouTube will archive it so you can go back and watch from the beginning. And while you're there, I hope you'll also check out some of the other author events that we've done. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Y'all take care.